Hello and welcome to this episode 19 of the 4-Minute Mull. I think it's been easily over a month since episode 18. That's just travel and work. And frankly, there hasn't been all that much to talk about. There is now, though, in the form of the big news of the moment, which is that WADA and the UCI have decided that they will drop the case against Chris Froome for that adverse analytical finding for salbutamol at last year's Vuelta. And this is obviously a massively controversial decision, very polarizing, and it has some implications for anti-doping and the credibility of sport that I'd like to explore in this video. I hope you'll appreciate that there's a lot of history, backstory, and context. Those of you who followed me for a while will know my views on doping, anti-doping, cycling, Sky, and Froome, and I can't cover that all in this video, so please forgive me for any omissions. I hope you'll also appreciate that I'm not generally someone who's prone to hyperbole and to exaggeration, and so when I say sincerely that I think that yesterday's development was one of the most disillusioning things for anti-doping in the last 20 years, I do so with real seriousness and gravity. I think that it did enormous damage to anti-doping, and I want to explain to you why that damage exists. And that's true, by the way, irrespective of which side of this fence you sit. So whether you sit on this side and you believe that Chris Froome is innocent and that justice was served by yesterday's announcement, or whether you are on the other side, believing that Chris Froome was or is a doper and that yesterday's announcement was merely the latest in a long line of farcical anti-doping episodes, doesn't actually matter. The point is that anti-doping, and therefore the credibility of the sport, has been affected by this whole process. And not just for salbutamol either, but for all drugs. And I'll talk about some of those and try and share with you why I think that. The other reason, incidentally, that yesterday is frustrating is because it gives impetus or license, an opportunity to charlatans like the Roger Federer of table tennis, the Kellyanne Conway of journalism, to crawl out from the cave that they've been hiding in, having not written a word about cycling for almost a year, to suddenly come out and spout crap, quoting from Richard Freeman's book about how Bradley Wiggins owes his Tour de France success in part to going on long, hard training rides without eating any carbohydrates or energy, as though this is the innovation that has led to dominance of one of the hardest endurance sports in the world, and that it's somehow a new thing that people haven't discovered. And it's the being taken for idiots by people like Syed, Freeman, Sky, Froome, Kerrison, that I think pisses people off quite a lot more than simply doping and overcoming anti-doping. Speaking of being taken for idiots, let's begin dissecting the Chris Froome decision by looking at the UCI's press release that was published yesterday to accompany the announcement. So I think that there are two important points in this press release. And remember, we're playing with one or two cards of the deck here because, of course, none of this stuff has been made public. WADA wants to assure us, we'll get to this, that everything's above board, trust us and enjoy the cycling. And so we're not going to see, I think, most of the information, the evidence, and how it was considered. So we're speculating. But we go to the middle of that press release and we see one interesting thing jump out. And that's that WADA have judged the evidence. They have considered all the relevant evidence in detail in consultation with its own experts and experts from WADA, and then based on the specific facts, and in light of WADA's unparalleled access to information, and this is the key bit, and authorship of the salbutamol regime, the UCI has decided, based on WADA's position, to close the proceedings against Mr. Froome. So what we have there is that WADA and the UCI have actually worked very closely on this together. Presumably the UCI have gone to WADA and said, listen, if we rule this way, will you back it? Will you stand in support of your own policy? You were the authors of that policy. And that's what it says. WADA, as the authors of the salbutamol regime, were consulted about how they would respond, and they stood back from their own line. In other words, the people who created the regulation were not prepared to defend it in the face of the challenge and those 1,500 pages of documents. I get it. I'm sure that's very intimidating. But they have drawn a line. They've said, this is the threshold, this is how it works, this is what we believe. And then they have relented. They have failed to hold their own line. And that is a failure of process and of governance and accountability in anti-doping. The next bit, which would actually be humorous if it wasn't so disillusioning and frustrating, comes at the end of the press release, where the UCI says that it understands that there will be significant discussion of this decision, But then it wishes to reassure us, all those involved or interested in cycling, that its decision is based on expert opinions, WADA's advice, and a full assessment of the facts of the case. The UCI hopes, and this is the funny bit, that the cycling world can now turn its focus to and enjoy the upcoming races on the cycling calendar. As if, after 20 years of incompetence and mismanagement and corruption and turning a blind eye and being forced to confront doping, as if people are going to simply take your word and your assurances and then go away and enjoy cycling. Maybe the new fans to cycling, the ones who are gullible enough to swallow the crap that Matthew Syed and Team Sky feed them, maybe they'll buy that, but most people will not. And as for WADA, an organization that has only made progress in anti-doping thanks to the efforts of journalists, an organization who generally rejects the efforts of those journalists until it hits them in the forehead as front-page newspaper headlines, which they then reluctantly admit show that there's a doping problem in Russia or in Kenya or in track and field or in whichever sport you wish to choose to discuss today. I think I'll take a hard pass from both of you on trusting you and going forward and enjoying the sport. Thanks very much for the offer, though. Moving away from the specifics of this incident, to rather talk about how it will have broader implications for anti-doping in sport potentially in the future, let's talk a little bit about what has happened here. What has happened is that the premise that underpins anti-doping has been shown to be flawed. The foundation of anti-doping is that we will test your blood or your urine, we will find a substance, we will then pursue effectively prosecution, and we will sanction you. In other words, it's find the substance, sanction, law and order, if you wish, from the TV show. There are two arms to the process. There's the ability to detect the substance, and then there's the ability to enforce a ban when that substance is found. Now, we know that step one is massively ineffective. In track and field, between 30 and 40% of all athletes confess to doping, and only 1.8% of them will ever fail a drugs test. That's how effective testing is. But then, the step beyond testing is the ability of the authorities to defend their own test in the face of sometimes very strong legal challenges. In other words, how robust, how credible, how believable is that test result? Because obviously, if there's a chance of a false positive or a test result that incorrectly identifies a non-doper as a doper, then the whole thing collapses in on itself. And what this Froome case has shown is that when a strong enough legal challenge is brought against, in this case, salbutamol, the WADA and the UCIs of this world cannot stand and defend their own line against those challenges. Now, you might think that this is unique to salbutamol as a threshold drug. And remember, what that means is that the athlete is allowed to use it up to a point, but not beyond. But my contention is that this is actually true of many banned substances. Think for a moment about the biological passport. That is a system which is based on the premise that there is a normal variation in your blood values, and that if you exceed normal, then you are indicated as possibly doping. The question is, what's normal? Because if normal looks like this, then you can set your limits here. But if normal does that, then your limits have to necessarily be a lot wider, because if you made them narrower, then normal variation would start to look like doping, and you would be catching people who were innocent, false positives. And so the biological passport has had to move in a conservative direction with wider limits than you would ideally want, because that means you are less likely to catch people who are clever about how they dope. That's where microdosing works. And so for salbutamol and for the biological passport, the question that authorities face is, where do you set those cutoffs? Where do we say that the use of salbutamol indicates doping as opposed to normal use? And what the Sky, Chris Froome, salbutamol decision does is it shows that the authorities couldn't defend that line. And so he's arguing that effectively it's a false positive. He used it as indicated, normal dosages, and still managed to exceed that line by 43%, even after correction for dehydration. And that's 43% above the upper limit, which itself is probably 500% higher than a normal value. And so the whole premise of how you draw these lines is challenged. It doesn't even end there. Remember the case of Stephen Colver, an Irish sprinter, who was popped for EPO and protested his innocence, and still does to this day. but eventually abandoned the case, trying to prove his innocence because he ran out of money and basically will to fight. But then about a year ago, a group of very credible Norwegian scientists took a look at his case, and they questioned the accuracy and the validity of the test that sanctioned him, because when they looked at the same page result, this is a gel method that's used to identify whether EPO in the system is artificial, which is to say injected as opposed to natural, they said that they couldn't distinguish between Colver and another person who didn't have EPO in their system. And then later on, a second test disagreed with the first test in the case of Colver. So one of those two tests is obviously incorrect. And so what you have is a set of tests, in this case, for a binary question. There is either EPO or there's not. It's a yes or no answer. It's there or it isn't. And even there, two groups of experts disagreed about how you would evaluate Colvert's sample. And then the tests disagreed with one another. If Colvert had had more money and better lawyers like Froome, he would have been able to undermine the credibility and the robustness of that EPO test in the same way that Froome has done for salbutamol. So EPO, biological passport, salbutamol, I guarantee you growth hormone will be the same, possibly even drugs like testosterone. The sensitivity and the specificity, and I know those words start to get complex, so let's keep it simple. The possibility of false positives and false negatives is a massive issue facing anti-doping, and they don't know where those lines exist. They can't tell you that in 100 non-dopers, there is a 100% chance that you will never have a positive test. So false positives may happen. False negatives definitely happen. You can be a doper and get away with it because the test isn't sensitive. And one of the problems, and this is legitimately an issue for many areas of diagnosis, not just diagnosing doping, is that as the sensitivity improves, the specificity often drops. Because the more likely you are to catch a doper, the more likely you are to catch a non-doper with a false positive. And so that's a real dilemma. And it is the foundation on which doping control exists. And when it is undermined in the way that Froome has done with this case, then the whole premise behind anti-doping is challenged. And that's why I say with such gravity that this is a big blow for anti-doping. What they have done is they've effectively managed to turn strict liability around. In the past, testing, poor as it is, would find an athlete with a banned substance, and the athlete would then have to prove that they were innocent despite having that substance. What Froome has done is he has managed to shift the onus back onto the authorities by saying to them, can you prove to me that your test is robust enough and valid and credible enough that you don't think with some degree of uncertainty that I'm a false positive? And they couldn't do it. And that undermines anti-doping. And I know that WADA and the UCI, they'll say that there's no problem, but the reality is that there is. And I don't know whether there'll be people in the future who bring enough money and lawyer power to the question when they're accused of doping. But if they do, they will probably win their cases as well. Because Froome has shown how you can switch liability around. And that's a big, big problem. As I said, it's a problem irrespective of which side of the divide you sit on. Whether you believe Froome is innocent or not, it's a problem. And just think for a moment about how many innocent athletes might have been sanctioned, had to take their medicine, or perhaps, let me put that differently, have had to take the punishment despite not taking the medicine because of dodgy tests, and they simply didn't have the lawyers and the 1,500 pages with which they could beat WADA and the UCI into submission. That's a big problem for anti-doping. And so I'm sorry that this is quite negative and cynical, but as I said, this is a very disillusioning blow. And it's not, by the way, it's not as though this is new. There has been a group of fairly vocal critics of the anti-doping system and the science that underpins anti-doping for a while. We've had discussions bordering on this in the past, so we have been headed in that direction. But what yesterday did is help us take a big, big step towards the finish line along the path that we were headed. And the finish line is the point at which anti-doping has zero credibility left. As it is, it's only got a small amount, in my opinion. It just got closer to having none. That's all. I've gone on for way too long. Thanks for your time and for your listening and attention. And hopefully next time we can talk about something not quite as shitty as this. Ciao.